I want to take us to a topic that you reminded me of because you mentioned Jordan, and Jordan is famous for his competitiveness. And, for those who have watched The Last Dance or studied Jordan in any capacity are familiar with just how crazy he was in terms of how competitive he was and the lengths that he went to achieve the results that he did. But kind of tying in with the theme of this podcast and certainly perhaps your book as well is like this balance, right? And you talk about this idea of competitiveness versus hyper competitiveness, and I was hoping you kind of just break down the difference and what the right amount of competitiveness truly is.
Yeah, so again, you're spot on. It gets to the nuance that doesn't sell well on social media, but is the reality. So there's this idea that is like hyper competitiveness is when we can't shut it off, when it feels like, everything is personal, everything is on the line, any sort of opportunity to compete, like we've got to do it. It's Michael Jordan, but it's also the person who we all know who, maybe plays Monopoly or whatever with their kids and family. And you're just like, oh, dear God, I don't want to play with this person because they're going to take this way too seriously when we're just, trying to fill some time with the family after Christmas or whatever it is, right? That is the hyper competitiveness when everything is a proving ground. Okay. Being a competitor, you're going to have some of that, but it's just enough balanced where you care about competing, you care about developing, and you can flip that switch when you need to go into competitor mode, but you can also turn it off. And generally speaking, again, there's always exceptions, but generally speaking, when you live in hyper competitive mode, you tend to burn out quicker. You tend to more likely actually choke because it feels like when you're in the high pressure situations, like again, the game is do or die. You do all the things that we talked about at the beginning. And third, you're more likely to compete unethically, meaning you're going to cheat in order to win. Now, Jordan is an interesting example because I think he was definitely a hyper competitive athlete. And it worked as an athlete. It didn't work so well when he was an executive and trying to play against his players when he was 40 and ruining Kwame Brown or whatever. But I think the reason it worked as an athlete, and I make the case in the book, Win the Inside Game, is that Jordan didn't start winning his championships until I believe it was his sixth or seventh year in the league. He was already a bona fide star. He was already one of the best in the world. But what happened is Phil Jackson came in. And Phil Jackson, the coach, is known as the Zen master, right? He takes the Eastern philosophy, applies it to basketball, essentially letting go, mindfulness, all of these things, decreasing his ego. He once gave Shaq, a book on ego detachment. Do we think Shaq read it? Maybe not, but like he gave him it because he thought Shaq's ego was getting too big. Now, I'm not trying to give too much credit to Phil Jackson, but I think it's interesting that Jackson and Jordan combined were those championship years. Meaning, I'm not saying Jordan let go of his hyper competitiveness, but with the counterbalance of Jackson, it balanced him just enough, just tugged on it just enough to allow Jordan to be a teammate, to still have that competitiveness, but to work with guys like Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman, who, again, if you look at The Last Dance, like, I'm not sure he has the best relationship with any of those guys now. But while Jackson was there, they made it freaking work. And I think it's similar, although not as hyper competitive. Kobe had more of a balance underneath. Like, I think it's also interesting that Kobe was super competitive, but his championships came under Jackson as well. Because I think if you look at these people who are super competitive, super strivers, like have this ability of single-minded focus, they need someone to just barely counterbalance that nudge to get the most out of themselves, instead of someone who's like double downing on that and saying, hey, I want you to go there more, go there more, go there more.
Yeah, Phil Jackson's book, by the way, 11 Rings, I think it's called, it's somewhere back there. It's a fantastic read and really dives into his mindset. we had George Mumford on the podcast, who obviously worked with Kobe and MJ, and was able to teach them this idea of being centered and just being there in the present, and the importance of that. I highly recommend you go check out George's work, and certainly check out Phil Jackson's book. But yeah, it's interesting. The point of counterbalancing, Jordan and Kobe's, hyper drive or hyper competitiveness is certainly one. I always knew about Phil Jackson as a Zen master, obviously from reading the book and just learning about him, and from even, The Last Dance. But I guess the impact that it had on Jordan and Kobe, I just never thought that deeply about what was it specifically about Phil that impacted them so deeply. Because I also always, as a basketball fan, I always thought about the X's and O's. And I was like, well, the triangle, and, Phil Jackson just knew how to put right people in the right place. But the mindset side of it and the psychology side, it just never connected for me.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and I love George Mumford's work as well. So highly check that out. In your interview, I think it's interesting because often when it comes to coaching, whether we're talking about basketball or track or anything in between, football, what we often do is we default towards the X's and O's. Okay, because we think, oh, triangle offense, put the right people. This is the thing, but we forget that like these coaches are working with these athletes on a day-to-day basis, taking the temperature of the team, like figuring out how do we keep these things together. And I would argue if you look at the really good coaches, and I think Jackson is obviously included this, like people like Steve Kerr, people like Pete Carroll, what they're really good at is taking the temperature of the team and the people in front of them and saying, okay, how do we get all these pieces to fit together mentally and psychologically and like keep the momentum going? When I was way back when I was in grad school, I happened to take a summer school class that was taught by a guy named Charlie Casserly. Now, Charlie Casserly was the general manager for the Washington Redskins when they won the Super Bowl, and then was later the general manager for the Houston Texans. So lots of success in the NFL. And it was me and like 5 other students somehow in this class on leadership with Charlie Casserly in between his NFL jobs and work. And I remember him sitting there saying, he said, my job and our job as, general manager, coaching staff is to make sure that everybody in that building knew their role and knew how they were contributing. And if they didn't, problems would arise. And he said, I had this rule that I called the bottom 20% rule, which if I looked around at the team and saw all those guys who maybe only played, on the kickoff or return team, or only were the practice squad people who got beat up every week in practice but never saw the game field, I had to make sure that those people knew they were contributing to winning, because if I didn't, that discomfort, that uncertainty, that kind of like mumbling would work its way up to the team. And that struck me again as a young person, but as a, now looking back, is I think that, we often discount the temperature check, the culture manipulation, the how do we get these pieces to fit together? How do we nudge, this hyper competitive Jordan just enough so that he can work with Scottie Pippen and be okay doing so for years without them losing their minds? And I think that is where the magic happens. And you sometimes see it, right? You see it with athletes who somehow fit together and accomplish great things on one team, and then they leave and they go to another situation. And then you're just like, oh man, that guy's creating all sorts of problems or just going off the rails. How in the world did so-and-so coach or team keep them centered and productive and in line? And often I don't know exactly, but you can point to probably there was some coaching staff, some admin, some people who are like, okay, like we gotta make this fit and make this person buy in the right way so that it works. And the new team probably didn't.